Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. On a warm summer evening in early July 2011, Melissa Carter got into her car and began the familiar drive toward Durham, North Carolina. She had made the trip many times before. She was going to pick up her children from their father, Daniel Reeves. The exchange was never easy, never comfortable, but it was routine. Melissa believed that if she kept things calm and predictable, it would be better for the boys. She never came home. At first, the silence did not cause panic. Melissa had been known to lose track of time. Maybe traffic had slowed her down. Maybe her phone battery had died. Friends sent messages and waited. Hours turned into a full day, then two. By the third day, worry settled into something heavier, something colder. Behind the scenes, something terrible had already happened. Melissa Carter was born on May 18, 1985, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to Thomas and Elaine Carter. From the moment she could walk, Melissa was full of energy and warmth. She was the kind of child teachers remembered years later, curious, talkative, quick to laugh. She loved drawing. Coloring books spread across the floor for hours at a time, completely lost in her own imagination. Her family attended a small community church where Melissa quickly became known as the girl who volunteered for everything, helping younger kids, organizing events, staying late just to clean up. She wanted to be useful, wanted to feel needed. When Melissa was 11, her parents' marriage began to fall apart. The arguments were loud, frequent, and impossible to ignore. By the time the divorce was finalized, Melissa had learned a lesson she would carry into adulthood. Love was fragile. Stability could disappear overnight. After the split, her mother moved Melissa across the state. New school, new town, new faces. Melissa struggled quietly. She smiled on the outside, but inside she felt rootless, always afraid that whatever happiness she found could be taken away just as easily. She threw herself into art as a way to cope. Graphic design became her outlet. Lines, shapes, colors, things she could control. After graduating high school, she enrolled in a community college studying digital design and marketing. Professors described her as talented and disciplined, someone who could have gone far if she believed in herself a little more. In her mid-20s, Melissa relocated again, this time to North Carolina, hoping for a clean slate. She found work doing freelance design, small marketing contracts, and eventually a steady position with a local real estate firm. For the first time in years, she began to feel grounded. She made friends. Real friends, people who checked on her, who invited her over, who knew her story. Then, in the spring of 2008, Melissa met Daniel Reeves. They met at a downtown bar where a local band was playing. Daniel was on stage, guitar slung low, voice confident, eyes always scanning the crowd. He had presence. He knew it too. When Melissa mentioned that they shared the same birthday, Daniel laughed and called it fate. Daniel had grown up in the Raleigh area. He came from a deeply religious family and had been immersed in music from a young age. To outsiders, he seemed charismatic, creative, driven. He spoke about big plans, albums, tours, a future that sounded exciting and limitless. What Melissa did not see at first were the cracks beneath the surface. Daniel had been married once before, briefly, right out of high school. The marriage ended badly, leaving him bitter and resentful. He had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression, prescribed medication he took sporadically, if at all. Instead, he relied on alcohol, drugs, and increasingly erratic beliefs to manage his moods. As the relationship progressed, Daniel's darker traits emerged. He was jealous, suspicious. He checked Melissa's phone, questioned her whereabouts, criticized her friends. Slowly, he began to isolate her from the very support system she had worked so hard to build. Still, when Daniel proposed just months into the relationship, Melissa said yes. Her friends were shocked, some were openly concerned, but Melissa wanted to believe in love, wanted to believe she had finally found something solid. The wedding was small and rushed. Looking back, several people would later say it felt less like a celebration and more like a decision made under pressure. Soon after, Melissa became pregnant. She was thrilled. She saw motherhood as a chance to create the family she never truly had growing up. Daniel's reaction was far more muted. He complained about responsibility, about money, about being tied down. But when their son Lucas was born, Melissa poured everything she had into him. Daniel, meanwhile, continued chasing music gigs, disappearing for days at a time. He cheated openly. He drank heavily. When Melissa confronted him, he accused her of being controlling, of trying to ruin his life. Eventually, Daniel announced he had an opportunity out of state, a job, a fresh start. He left without hesitation, leaving Melissa alone with their infant son. While away, he began a relationship with another woman, Vanessa Monroe, an aspiring actress living in New York. Vanessa was charming, ambitious, and financially comfortable. She had money, jewelry, connections. Daniel had none of those things. To him, Vanessa represented freedom and opportunity. He flaunted the affair, using it to humiliate Melissa, to remind her how replaceable she was. That should have been the end, but then Melissa found out she was pregnant again. Despite everything, she gave Daniel another chance, not because she trusted him, but because she feared repeating her parents' mistakes. She wanted her children to have a father. She wanted to believe people could change. She moved to be closer to him. The situation only worsened. Daniel resented her presence. He resented the children. When their second son, Noah, was born with medical complications, the stress pushed the relationship past its breaking point. They returned to North Carolina for better care. Daniel blamed Melissa for everything. By then, Vanessa was fully entrenched in his life. Daniel eventually took Lucas under the pretense of a short visit. He never brought him back. Melissa later discovered through social media that Daniel had secretly married Vanessa and was living with her and her child. Then came the final betrayal. Melissa learned that her marriage to Daniel had never been legal. The paperwork had never been completed. His signature was missing. And soon after, Daniel and Vanessa filed for emergency custody of Lucas. Melissa's world collapsed. She fought back. She documented the abuse. She pushed for evaluations. The court eventually ordered psychological assessments. Daniel failed them badly. Melissa was described as attentive, stable, and deeply bonded with her children. A temporary custody arrangement was put in place, but Daniel was unraveling, and beneath the surface, something far darker was taking shape. On July 13, 2011, Melissa texted Daniel to say she was on her way to pick up the boys. That message was the last anyone ever received from her. Melissa's car was still parked outside her apartment the next morning. That alone unsettled the people closest to her. Melissa was meticulous about routines. If she planned to be gone overnight, she packed. If she planned to leave town, she told someone. Her purse, laptop, and phone charger were still inside her apartment. Nothing suggested she intended to disappear. Her best friend, Jordan, was the first to call the police, but at that stage, officers treated Melissa as a voluntary missing adult. She was 26 years old, legally free to go wherever she wanted. Still, Jordan insisted something was wrong. Melissa had an appointment scheduled the next day. She had work obligations. Most importantly, she would never vanish without her children. Detectives began with the basics. They reviewed surveillance footage from Melissa's apartment complex. Cameras captured her leaving the building that evening, walking toward her car, keys in hand. She looked calm, normal. The footage never showed her returning. Her phone records told a similar story. The last outgoing message was a text sent to Daniel Rees just after sunset. "On my way." No reply ever came back. Investigators turned their attention to Daniel and his new wife, Vanessa Monroe. When officers arrived at their apartment in Durham with a search warrant, neither Daniel nor Vanessa was home. What greeted them inside was deeply unsettling. The smell hit first. Bleach, strong enough to sting the eyes. The apartment was unnaturally clean, as if someone had scrubbed every surface in a hurry. Several items were conspicuously missing. Rugs, a shower curtain, a vacuum cleaner. There were patches on the hardwood floor where the wood looked warped and discolored, consistent with harsh chemical use. In the master bedroom, detectives discovered 2 pieces of paper on the nightstand. The first was a handwritten song draft titled "Final Silence." The lyrics described a woman pleading for mercy, being choked until she stopped breathing. It read less like poetry and more like a confession. The second document was even more disturbing. It appeared to be a signed agreement in which Melissa supposedly agreed to relinquish custody of her children to Daniel in exchange for a cash payment. The signature at the bottom looked shaky and forced. Friends and family immediately dismissed it as fake. Melissa would never bargain away her children, not for any amount of money. Police escalated the case immediately. Using credit card records and traffic cameras, they reconstructed Daniel and Vanessa's movements in the days following Melissa's disappearance. Vanessa was seen with the children at a fast food restaurant less than 12 hours after Melissa vanished. Daniel, meanwhile, was caught on camera visiting multiple stores late at night. His purchases were chilling: cleaning chemicals, industrial trash bags, protective gloves, duct tape, a reciprocating saw with replacement blades, a lint roller. The following day, Daniel rented a utility trailer. Shortly after that, Vanessa called her sister in Texas, asking if she could watch the children for a few days. The explanation was vague: a family emergency, stress. She sounded nervous. When Daniel and Vanessa arrived in Texas, investigators followed close behind. Vanessa's sister, Karen Whitfield, agreed to speak with police. What she told them raised every alarm imaginable. On the night they arrived, Daniel had asked about a nearby canal known for thick vegetation and dangerous wildlife. He asked whether animals there could destroy a body, whether alligators fed in the area, whether currents would carry things away. Karen thought the questions were strange, but brushed them off at the time. The next day, Daniel borrowed a boat. That was enough. Law enforcement launched a coordinated search of the canal area. It took hours. Thick reeds clogged the water. Visibility was poor. The terrain was treacherous. Eventually, officers found what they feared most: human remains. Identification took time. The body had been badly damaged. Forensic specialists later confirmed it was Melissa Carter. The cause of death was determined to be either manual strangulation or a severe blow to the neck. The injuries indicated she had been alive and conscious during the attack. Back in North Carolina, Daniel and Vanessa were arrested at Daniel's parents' home. During questioning, both offered carefully constructed stories, each blaming the other. Daniel claimed Melissa showed up unexpectedly and threatened Vanessa. According to him, Vanessa panicked and attacked Melissa while Daniel tried to intervene. He admitted to helping clean up afterward, but insisted he hadn't killed her. Vanessa told a different story. She said Daniel and Melissa argued while she stayed in another room with the children. She claimed Melissa fell and hit her head. When she returned, Daniel told her Melissa had left. Only later, she said, did he confess the truth and threaten her to silence. Neither version matched the evidence: the forged custody document, the bleach, the shopping spree, the disposal site, the lies. Investigators believed Melissa had been lured to the apartment under false pretenses, promises of seeing her children, maybe even hoped that Daniel would finally give up custody. Once she arrived, the confrontation escalated. She was likely forced to write the fake agreement. When she refused, she was attacked. The crime was methodical, planned, cruel. Daniel was charged with first-degree murder. Vanessa was charged as an accomplice and later with evidence tampering. Their trials were scheduled separately. As the case moved forward, Melissa's friends and family were left grappling with unbearable grief. Her children were placed in the care of Daniel's parents, who expressed horror and disbelief at their son's actions. Those close to Melissa struggled with guilt, replaying conversations, wishing they had intervened sooner. In court, prosecutors painted Daniel as a manipulative narcissist who viewed people as obstacles rather than humans. They argued he eliminated Melissa because she threatened his control and his image. Vanessa, they said, chose loyalty over morality. Daniel showed no remorse during proceedings. He smiled, he joked, he stared coldly at the courtroom. Vanessa cried frequently, though many questioned whether her tears were genuine. The jury deliberated carefully, but the verdict was clear. Daniel Reeves was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Vanessa Monroe received a significantly lighter sentence, though additional charges ensured she would spend many years behind bars. Melissa Carter's life ended because she trusted someone who had already shown her who she was. She believed love could fix what control had broken. She believed protecting her children meant enduring anything. She was wrong. But her story did not end with silence. It ended with truth and justice. The courtroom was packed on the morning Daniel Reeves was sentenced. Reporters filled the back rows, family members sat stiffly along the walls, and Melissa Carter's parents held hands in the front row, bracing themselves for whatever came next. By then, the facts of the case were no longer in question. The only thing left was accountability. Prosecutors spent hours laying out the full scope of Daniel's actions. They didn't rush. They wanted the court to understand that Melissa's death wasn't the result of a single bad moment or a heated argument. It was the final step in a long pattern of manipulation, control, and entitlement. Daniel hadn't just taken Melissa's life. He had spent years trying to erase her voice, her independence, and her role as a mother. They walked the jury through the timeline again, the false promises, the text message that lured her to the apartment, the forged custody agreement meant to strip her of her children even in death, the purchases made in the middle of the night, the calculated effort to destroy evidence. Every action pointed in one direction. Daniel wanted Melissa gone, permanently. When it was time for the defense to speak, there was little left to argue. Daniel's attorney attempted to frame him as mentally unstable, overwhelmed by stress, trapped in a chaotic custody battle. They hinted at remorse without ever directly naming it. The strategy fell flat. Then Daniel was given the chance to speak. He stood slowly, adjusted his jacket, and looked around the room. His expression never softened. He talked about faith, about forgiveness, about how the media had misunderstood him. He did not say Melissa's name. He did not acknowledge her children. He did not apologize. For many in the courtroom, that was the moment any lingering doubt disappeared. The judge was direct when delivering the sentence. He described the crime as deliberate, calculated, and devastating. He spoke about Melissa not as a victim, but as a person, a mother, a daughter, a friend, someone who trusted the wrong person and paid with her life. Daniel Reeves was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Vanessa Monroe's sentencing came months later, and it carried a different weight. Unlike Daniel, Vanessa showed emotion. She cried. She spoke about fear, about manipulation, about being trapped in an abusive relationship. Her defense painted her as someone who made terrible choices under pressure. The judge acknowledged that Daniel was the primary architect of the crime, but he was clear about one thing. Vanessa had opportunities to stop what happened. She had opportunities to tell the truth. Instead, she helped hide a body, lied repeatedly to investigators, and protected a murderer. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with additional time added for evidence tampering. Reactions were mixed. Some felt the sentence was too light. Others believed it reflected the complexity of her role. For Melissa's family, no sentence felt sufficient. Nothing could bring her back. In the months that followed, the media attention faded, but the consequences did not. Melissa's children remained with Daniel's parents, who committed themselves to raising them with honesty and care. They made a promise that the boys would know who their mother was, not through court transcripts or headlines, but through stories. Stories of her kindness, her creativity, her laughter, her devotion. Friends struggled with grief in quieter ways. Jordan kept replaying her last conversation. Others remembered moments when Melissa had hinted at fear, moments they hadn't taken seriously enough. Therapy sessions were filled with guilt and what-ifs. But slowly, something else emerged. Anger turned into resolve. Melissa's story began circulating in advocacy circles, particularly those focused on coercive control and domestic abuse that doesn't always leave visible bruises. Experts pointed out how often situations like hers are dismissed because the danger isn't immediate or obvious, because the abuser is charming, because the violence escalates privately. Melissa's case became a cautionary example of how custody battles can be weaponized, how manipulation can be just as deadly as physical force, and how systems can fail people who are doing their best to protect their children. Her parents established a small foundation in her name, focused on legal support for mothers navigating high-conflict custody disputes. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy, but it helped real people. That mattered. Years later, when people spoke about Melissa, they rarely started with how she died. They talked about her art, her patience, the way she could make anyone feel seen, the way she loved her children so fiercely that she kept showing up even when it put her at risk. Her story didn't end the night she got into her car. It continued in the lives she touched, the conversations she sparked, and the quiet determination of those who refused to let her be reduced to a case file. There was no dramatic redemption, no clean resolution, just the slow, painful work of rebuilding after something irreversible. And maybe that is the most honest ending. Melissa trusted someone she shouldn't have. She stayed longer she should have. She hoped harder she should have. But she was not weak. She was human. And her story stands as a reminder that love should never require silence, fear, or sacrifice of self. When control disguises itself as care, when manipulation pretends to be devotion, the danger is already there. Melissa didn't get the chance to choose herself in the end, but because her story is told, maybe someone else will. It began like dozens of other family nights before it, ordinary enough to be forgotten. On a cool Friday evening in the late 1980s, 11-year-old Ethan Walker sat in a vinyl booth at Riverside Pizza, a popular family restaurant in the small city of Hillside, Oregon. Neon lights buzzed softly above arcade machines lining the back wall. The smell of melted cheese and soda syrup filled the air. Kids laughed, parents talked over one another. Nothing about the night hinted that it would end in silence. Ethan was there with his mother, Linda Walker, and his older sister, Rachel. Friday pizza nights were routine for the Walkers, a small tradition squeezed into busy weeks. Ethan loved them mostly for the arcade. He had already finished his second slice and was bouncing in his seat, eyes fixed on the blinking lights of a Galaga machine. He asked his mom for quarters, the same way he always did, holding out his palm with a grin. Linda dug through her purse and handed him a few coins, reminding him not to wander too far. Ethan promised, hopped down from the booth, and disappeared toward the arcade. At the time, Linda didn't watch him go. There was no reason to. Riverside Pizza was the kind of place where kids ran freely between tables, where staff knew regulars by name, where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. That was the last moment Linda Walker saw her son. Ethan Walker was born on August 3, 1977, and had grown up entirely in Hillside, a mid-sized town tucked between forests and highways. It was the kind of place where children still rode bikes until dusk and neighbors waved from their porches. Ethan attended Maple Ridge Elementary, where teachers described him as bright, curious, and quietly observant. At home, Ethan was known for his humor. He had a sharp wit for a kid his age and a habit of mimicking adults just well enough to make people laugh. Linda often said he had an old soul. He noticed things other kids didn't. He remembered conversations. He asked questions that caught people off guard. His closest friend was Noah Brooks, a boy who lived across the street. Noah had chronic health issues and spent much of his time indoors. Many kids drifted away because Noah couldn't always keep up. Ethan didn't. He went over nearly every day, bringing baseball cards or video game magazines, sitting for hours on the floor talking about nothing and everything. That loyalty defined Ethan. He loved skateboarding, arcade games, and baseball, especially Little League, where Noah's father volunteered as a coach. And despite his growing independence, Ethan still slept with the same faded blue blanket he'd had since kindergarten. It stayed on his bed every night. It made him feel safe. That blanket never left his room. On February 12, 1989, the Walkers' pizza night unfolded without incident at first. Ethan played games while Linda and Rachel talked. At one point, Ethan returned to the table breathless with excitement. He told his mom he had met a boy around his age, the son of someone who worked at the restaurant. The two had been playing games together and talking about going to a nearby school gym to watch a basketball game. Linda hesitated. She didn't know the other boy, but Ethan was confident, insistent that it was close by and that they'd be back quickly. After a brief pause, Linda agreed, telling him to be careful and come straight back. As Ethan stood up to leave, he turned back and asked, almost as an afterthought, if she could save him another slice of pizza. Linda smiled and said yes. Ethan walked out the front door of Riverside Pizza and into the night. The boys soon realized they had made a mistake. The game they were hoping to watch wasn't at the nearby middle school. It was at a high school several miles away in another town. Disappointed, they turned around and headed back toward the restaurant. They spent a little more time in the arcade. Witnesses later recalled seeing Ethan laughing, playing games, and acting completely normal. Around 9:15 p.m., Ethan said he was heading home. It was only a short walk. He had done it countless times before. He never arrived. Linda didn't panic at first. Ethan had been late before. She assumed he'd lost track of time or stopped to talk with friends. But as the minutes stretched into hours, unease settled in. By midnight, worry had turned into fear. By morning, there was no doubt. Ethan Walker was missing. Linda and her husband Mark contacted the Hillside Police Department immediately. They expected urgency, search teams, questions, action. Instead, they were told to wait. Officers suggested Ethan likely ran away and would return on his own. They mentioned a minor incident at school weeks earlier and speculated that Ethan might be scared of getting in trouble. They advised the Walkers not to overreact. Linda was stunned. Ethan had shown no signs of wanting to leave. His clothes were untouched. His money was still in his drawer. His blanket was still on his bed. Everything about his life pointed to a boy who planned to come home. But police dismissed her concerns. No official search was launched. No alerts were issued. No canvassing began. Days passed. Hillside was not a low-crime town. With a population just under 80,000, it had pockets of violence and a steady rate of serious offenses. 5 or 6 major crimes occurred there every day. A missing child should have raised alarms. It didn't. Refusing to wait any longer, the Walkers began searching on their own. They printed flyers and walked the streets, knocking on doors, asking strangers if they had seen an 11-year-old boy with brown hair and a crooked smile. Their first stop was Riverside Pizza. Employees remembered Ethan. One woman from a nearby beauty store recalled seeing him earlier that night with an older teenage boy. Her account shifted each time she told it. First, she was certain, then she wasn't. She couldn't describe the teen clearly enough to identify him. The Walkers suspected the boy might be connected to the restaurant staff, but without a name or description, the lead went nowhere. Weeks turned into months. Only after nearly 4 months of relentless pressure did police finally agree to treat Ethan's disappearance as a serious case. By then, the most critical window for evidence had long closed. There was no media attention. Because Ethan had been labeled a runaway early on, newspapers showed little interest. Television stations ignored the story altogether. It was as if Ethan Walker had vanished not just from his street, but from public concern entirely. Then, one day after Ethan disappeared, something deeply unsettling happened. Maple Ridge Elementary received a phone call. The woman on the line claimed to be Ethan's grandmother. She told the school that Ethan would not be returning because he was moving to live with her in Idaho. The problem was simple. Ethan's grandmother was not in Idaho. She was in Hillside, and the voice on the phone was not hers. Even more disturbing was what the caller knew. She named Ethan's school correctly. She referenced details about his family that were not public, enough to sound convincing. There was no way to trace the call. It became another unanswered question in a case already full of them. And it was only the beginning. After the eerie phone call to Maple Ridge Elementary, the Walker family's nightmare deepened. Linda and Mark tried to comprehend what had happened that night, why Ethan had disappeared, and who could possibly have known such private details. The family's fear was compounded by the complete lack of assistance from the Hillside Police Department. Weeks of pleading for a real investigation yielded little. The police seemed convinced Ethan had run away. They had no Amber Alert system at the time in place for children classified as runaways in that jurisdiction. Linda refused to accept it. "My son doesn't run away," she told anyone who would listen, over and over. She began posting flyers at local schools, shops, libraries, and gas stations. Rachel helped too, placing the same flyers in grocery stores and arcades. The community was sympathetic, but nothing turned up. Every tip seemed to evaporate into thin air. Then a lead appeared, brief, incomplete, and frustratingly inconclusive. A man working at a nearby convenience store remembered seeing Ethan walking down Riverside Avenue the night he vanished, accompanied by an older teen he did not recognize. The witness described him as tall for his age, wearing a black leather jacket with dark hair and a scruffy look. At first it seemed promising. Perhaps the boy had befriended Ethan and meant no harm, but when investigators tried to identify him, the trail ended. The teen, if he even existed, was gone. Riverside Pizza's staff were equally evasive. Nobody could provide a clear answer. By the time 3 months had passed, Linda had become a fixture at the police station. She would sit in the lobby for hours, pleading with officers, showing them every picture, describing every detail of Ethan's last known movements. Her desperation and the unyielding dismissal of her concerns left her exhausted and numb. Mark, though supportive, struggled to maintain hope. He spent nights pacing their hillside home, thinking over each decision that evening, the quarters, the arcade, the basketball game that didn't exist. Every small choice haunted him. Then, one morning in late April, the Walkers awoke to flashing lights outside their home. The Hillside Police Department had returned, this time in full force. Officers, bloodhounds, and personnel in hazmat suits surrounded the Walker property. The family was shocked, confused, and terrified. No one had informed them why. For hours, the house was searched from attic to basement. Every room was turned over, every closet opened, every inch of yard combed. When the search finally ended, there was nothing, not a trace of Ethan, not a shred of evidence suggesting what had happened to him. Weeks later, the Walker family learned why. An anonymous tip had claimed that Ethan's body was buried somewhere on their property. The tip was unverified, and investigators had no other leads, yet they had acted as if the Walker home were the epicenter of a crime. Ethan's older brother, Dylan, who was 15 at the time, was also caught in the chaos. Hillside authorities, for reasons still unclear, questioned him extensively. He had been at a music rehearsal with his band miles away on the night Ethan disappeared, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses. yet Dylan was interrogated for over 5 hours. The police even required him to submit to a polygraph test. Despite his alibi, his youth, and lack of motive, he was treated as a suspect. The stress was unbearable. Dylan, once confident and outgoing, became withdrawn and anxious. For years, he struggled with nightmares and hypervigilance, symptoms later diagnosed as PTSD. The family tried to support him, but the damage was already done. The emotional toll of being wrongly suspected, combined with losing his younger brother, left deep scars. Meanwhile, Riverside Pizza suddenly closed. The owners packed up and left Hillside without warning. Their relocation to Los Angeles and then reportedly overseas to the Middle East was abrupt and suspicious. When investigators tracked them down briefly in Los Angeles, the trail went cold again. No one knew the name of the teen who had been seen with Ethan or if the owners even knew what happened that night. The Walker family was left with nothing but questions and frustration. Years passed and Ethan's case grew colder. The media largely ignored it. Local newspapers printed only brief, sporadic mentions, and television stations never covered the story. Public attention was minimal, and it seemed the world had moved on while the Walker family remained trapped in a nightmare. In 1993, a sliver of hope appeared when Ethan's face appeared in a Soul Island Runaway Train music video, a campaign designed to highlight missing children across America. Ethan's photograph flickered on the screen alongside dozens of other faces, a haunting reminder of the countless children who had vanished. Of the 36 children featured in the campaign, 26 were eventually found alive, but Ethan was not among them. For the Walkers, the video was bittersweet, a moment of recognition for their son, yet no answers. By the mid-1990s, the Walker family had learned to live with a void that could never be filled. Linda and Mark continued their search in small ways, posting flyers, attending local community meetings, and sharing Ethan's story with anyone willing to listen. Dylan and Rachel carried their own weight of grief, haunted by what had happened and the fact that they had been powerless to prevent it. Then a strange and unsettling encounter occurred in 2002. Ethan's nephew, Luke, now grown and working as a security officer in Hillside, was approached by an older man while on duty. The man struck up casual conversation, and at first nothing seemed unusual, but soon the stranger casually referred to Ethan as Sean, his rarely used middle name. That detail alone was chilling. Few people outside the immediate family had ever known it. The stranger then recounted specifics of Ethan's disappearance with unnerving familiarity: the pizza restaurant, the arcade, the supposed basketball game, and the anonymous phone call to the school. Luke was struck by the precision of the details. How could a stranger know so much about a case that had barely received attention outside Hillside? When Luke asked the man who he was, he vanished, leaving behind nothing but unease and unanswered questions. It was another dead end, another piece of the puzzle that raised more mystery than clarity. Years rolled on and the world changed. Advances in technology, from DNA profiling to online databases of missing children, gave hope to families long forgotten. By 2020, the Walker family, though aged and weary, remained determined. Linda's health had begun to decline, yet she refused to give up. Rachel, now married with children of her own, tirelessly advocated for renewed attention to Ethan's case. Dylan, still haunted by the past, lent his voice whenever possible. Finally, in 2022, a spark of renewed hope arrived. A true crime YouTube channel called Crime Seekers featured Ethan's story after a subscriber from Hillside requested it. The episode detailed every facet of his disappearance, from the arcade to Riverside Pizza, from the suspicious phone call to the fruitless police investigations. The video went viral in certain circles, bringing new attention to a case that had long been dormant. Around the same time, Hillside held a city council meeting. Linda, now 73, stood before officials with Rachel and Dylan by her side. Her voice trembled, but it carried decades of grief and determination. She pleaded for the city to help, to finally use modern tools to investigate Ethan's disappearance, DNA databases, forensic technology, cross-referencing old police reports, and tracing any possible leads. "I don't know if he's still alive," Linda admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "I may never see him again, but I need to know the truth. That's all I ask. Please help me bring him home, or at least bring peace to his family." Rachel followed with a firm plea. "It's not just about hope, it's about accountability. Our city failed us once, and we can't let it fail us again. Use the technology we have now. Don't let another child disappear into nothing." Dylan added his own words, his voice quiet but resolute. "I was a child when my brother vanished. I've lived with nightmares and unanswered questions my entire life. We can't undo the past, but we can stop history from repeating itself." Despite the renewed media coverage and public attention, investigators were limited. Without a suspect, without a confirmed lead, and without DNA to trace, progress was slow. Yet the renewed energy injected hope into the Walkers' hearts for the first time in decades. Linda, now increasingly frail, worried about what might happen before answers could come. She had lived over 30 years with the same uncertainty. Was Ethan alive? Had he been taken by someone with evil intent? Was he somewhere now, older, perhaps unaware of his true identity? Or had he passed, leaving his family in endless limbo? The questions haunted them every day. Sleep was scarce. Even routine moments, grocery shopping, driving, family gatherings, were colored by the absence of Ethan's presence. Holidays reminded them of birthdays missed, milestones uncelebrated, and a life that should have been lived but never was. Yet, amid the grief and frustration, the Walkers' resolve never wavered. Every phone call, every flyer, every social media post was a step toward the truth. Every new technology, every journalist willing to cover the story, and every true crime enthusiast online offered a glimmer of hope. Ethan would be 45 years old today. The odds that he survived the disappearance remain uncertain, and the possibility that he had been kidnapped and raised elsewhere lingers in the minds of his family. And yet, even decades later, hope remained. Not a naive hope, but a quiet, determined one. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. They wanted closure, no matter how long it took. The story of Ethan Walker is not just about one boy who vanished. It is about the failures of the system, the unrelenting grief of a family, the resilience required to keep searching, and the cruel twists of fate that can erase someone from the world in an instant. And while the trail remains cold, there are those who believe that the truth is out there somewhere, waiting to be uncovered. By the mid-2020s, the Walker family had lived more than 30 decades with a gaping absence in their lives. Linda Walker, once vibrant and full of energy, now moved slowly, her hair streaked with gray and her hands showing the wear of years spent searching, pleading, and hoping. Mark, her husband, had passed away quietly in 2009, a man who had never stopped believing that his youngest son would come home, yet had gone to the grave without ever seeing him. Dylan and Rachel continued to fight, now carrying their parents' mission forward with a stubborn determination. Every day without Ethan was another day of grief, but also a day of unbroken resolve. The renewed attention from the 2022 Crime Seekers episode had brought new investigators and resources into the case. Cold case detectives re-examined old witness statements, police logs, and the tips that had gone nowhere decades earlier. They scoured the archives of Riverside Pizza, reaching out to former employees and even long-departed owners. Every fragment, no matter how minor, was cataloged and cross-referenced with modern technology. Surveillance footage from neighboring businesses, long forgotten, was digitized and enhanced. DNA evidence from items that had once been overlooked or contaminated was carefully preserved for testing against national databases. But despite the technological advancements, no concrete lead had emerged. The teen reportedly seen with Ethan at the pizza place that night remained unidentified. Riverside Pizza's owners had vanished overseas shortly after the disappearance, leaving no forwarding addresses. The woman who claimed to be Ethan's grandmother, the call that had so unsettled the school, was never traced. Every path seemed to dead end in frustration, yet the family refused to relent. Linda, though growing frail, insisted on attending every meeting, every briefing, and every community appeal. She visited schools to speak to children about safety, even while wearing the shadow of her own tragedy. She met with city council members repeatedly, urging them to fund deeper investigations. She maintained Ethan's online presence, ensuring that his name, his face, and his story were never forgotten. Even if he's not alive, someone out there needs to know he existed, she would say. Then, in early 2023, a breakthrough arrived. Small, almost imperceptible, yet enough to ignite hope. A detective reviewing old neighborhood directories realized that the address of a former resident near Riverside Avenue had been overlooked. That resident, a man named Carl Whitman, had lived just blocks from the pizza place and had moved frequently over the years. Carl's name surfaced in multiple unrelated minor police reports, but nothing had previously linked him to the disappearance. Upon further investigation, authorities discovered that Carl had a criminal record spanning decades, including charges of abduction and fraud, though none had ever been fully prosecuted due to lack of evidence. The realization shook the family. Could Carl Whitman have been the teen's older accomplice, or even the orchestrator so many years ago? Investigators began tracing his movements in January '88, mapping his life against the night Ethan vanished. Carl had a history of preying on children, and on that particular night, records suggest he was in the area. It was circumstantial, yes, but it was the first lead in decades that pointed anywhere meaningful. Meanwhile, DNA testing on items recovered from Riverside Pizza and Ethan's home environment yielded partial matches to unsolved cases nationwide. While none conclusively identified Ethan, the results were promising, indicating that modern forensic science could at last uncover truths that had been buried under decades of neglect. Public attention returned as well. National media outlets began covering Ethan's story in greater detail, highlighting the systemic failures of the 1980s Hillside Police Department. The narrative shifted from despair to cautious optimism. Advocacy groups for missing children praised the Walkers for never giving up, showcasing their determination as a blueprint for families facing cold cases. For Dylan and Rachel, these developments were bittersweet. Every lead brought a mix of hope and fear. What if they finally discovered Ethan had been alive all this time, only to learn he had died years ago? What if the truth was even more devastating than the mystery itself? Still, their resolve never wavered. They traveled to follow every potential clue, from old neighborhoods to distant states where Carl Whitman or his associates might have lived. They interviewed former neighbors, friends of friends, and anyone who might remember an odd interaction or strange behavior around January '88. Despite the decades of frustration, there were rare moments of solace. The family bonded over memories, the sound of Ethan's laughter, his love of skateboards and arcade games, the way he helped Dylan with band rehearsals, the quiet nights he spent with his favorite blanket. They clung to these recollections, using them as fuel to continue their search. Yet the emotional toll remained profound. Linda struggled with insomnia and anxiety, often awake long into the night imagining the worst. She feared that she would not live to see the answers she so desperately sought. Rachel, balancing family life and the search for her brother, sometimes felt herself at breaking point. Dylan, carrying the weight of years of trauma from being wrongfully interrogated and blamed, occasionally questioned whether he could continue the fight. But each time, one word brought them together: Ethan. In early 2024, another development reignited hope. A woman living in Sacramento contacted the Hillside Police Department after seeing Ethan's face on a missing children website. She recalled a boy matching Ethan's description being in her neighborhood in the early 1990s, living with a man she did not know well. Though she could not provide a name, her details were specific enough to warrant follow-up. Investigators coordinated with federal agencies, tracing residency records and public documentation from the 1990s to the present. The trail was complicated. Over decades, addresses had changed, people had moved, records had been lost, and memories had faded. Still, each new lead allowed investigators to narrow the search area. Carl Whitman's associates were interviewed, though many were elderly or deceased. A few surviving witnesses recalled seeing a boy with light brown hair and a familiar laugh who resembled the missing child from Hillside. The Walkers, though exhausted, refused to give in. They used social media to maintain public awareness, sharing Ethan's story with new generations. Volunteers helped distribute flyers in neighborhoods where leads had surfaced. Fundraisers were organized to pay for private investigators and specialized search teams. Ethan's disappearance had long since become a cause beyond the Walker family, a symbol of the fight against neglect, bureaucratic failure, and forgotten children. In the fall of 2024, DNA testing finally produced a significant result. Partial matches suggested that a close relative of Carl Whitman had interacted with Ethan's genetic material years ago. It was not a definitive match, but it narrowed the field and gave investigators the focus they had lacked for decades. The Walkers allowed themselves cautious optimism. It was the first time in over 36 years that a concrete lead pointed to a specific individual potentially involved in Ethan's disappearance. Still, there was the lingering question: if Ethan had survived, where had he been all these years? Had he been kept in isolation, moved from place to place, unaware of his true identity? Or had he escaped the abduction early on, building a life under a new name? The uncertainty was almost unbearable, but the renewed investigation gave the family a sense of direction. Linda, now in her mid-70s, realized she might not live to see Ethan again, yet she continued her advocacy tirelessly. She gave interviews, spoke at conferences, and remained actively involved in every new lead. Rachel and Dylan became her primary partners in the search, ensuring that no lead went unchecked. The community, long and different, began to rally, offering tips and sharing memories that might help. As 2025 arrived, the case had evolved into a national effort. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states coordinated to follow the fragments of a trail that spanned decades. Each clue, no matter how small, was meticulously investigated. The story of Ethan Walker had become a symbol of perseverance, of a family refusing to give up even when the odds were stacked impossibly against them. Even without resolution, the walkers' persistence had already changed lives. Their advocacy led to policy changes within Hillside, ensuring that missing children are now treated with urgency, regardless of initial assumptions about runaway behavior. Families across the country cited Ethan's case as an example of why early action is critical, prompting communities to implement more proactive measures. The psychological impact on Dylan and Rachel remained profound. Therapy helped, but the trauma of wrongful suspicion, coupled with the years of uncertainty about Ethan's fate, left a permanent mark. Both siblings remained committed to keeping Ethan's story alive, ensuring that no other child would be neglected in the same way. Though the story does not conclude with definitive answers, it demonstrates something more enduring: the power of human resilience. Despite decades of obstacles, bureaucratic failures, missteps, uncooperative witnesses, and lost evidence, the Walkers never stopped fighting. They never allowed their son to be forgotten. And while Ethan's fate remains uncertain, the family's tireless advocacy serves as a beacon of hope for anyone touched by loss, injustice, or the chilling void of a missing loved one. The Walker family continues to live with hope tempered by reality. They may never learn exactly what happened to Ethan, and the years without him cannot be reclaimed. But in every flyer posted, every interview given, and every lead investigated, they honor his memory. They honor the boy who loved video games, who comforted his brother, who laughed with a sparkle that never faded from their hearts. Ethan Walker's story is not just about a missing child. It is about the persistence of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unwavering belief that even decades later, the truth can be found. It is a reminder that no matter how long the night, the search for light must continue. For Linda, Dylan, and Rachel, the journey is far from over. Every day, every lead, every memory keeps Ethan alive in their hearts and keeps the hope alive that one day they will finally know the truth. The story of Ethan Walker reminds us that children are never forgotten when families refuse to give up. It is a legacy of love and determination, a narrative of resilience in the face of impossible odds, and it serves as a warning, a lesson, and a beacon to ensure that no missing child will ever be dismissed, ignored, or abandoned.